Welcome back to Sankofa Summer School. I always say welcome back because we have been doing this for a long time, and we have folks who have been loyal supporters of Sankofa Summer School. So I welcome you back. But also, this is family, this is love, this is community. And so you are welcome here. And we want to make sure that you know that you're welcome here. Tonight, I am so excited for this particular class. I'm going to have my notes. I'm going to be taking notes. I'm going to be learning today, as I hope all of you will as well. We have a class today, Reflection, Eternal Hip Hop and African Folk Art, Birth in America by the one and only Timothy Welbeck. And I I have to say, I've known him for a few years now. And I am so impressed by his work and his commitment to making sure that hip hop remains in the conversation. And so when I sent out a call and I was asking people to do this, he immediately said he would be happy to do it. And so I'm so honored to have Timothy Welbeck join us for Sankofa Summer School. A little bit about him. He's the director of the Center of Anti-Racism at Temple University, where many of you know I got my doctorate. He's also a civil rights attorney by training. He's a scholar of law, race, and cultural studies, and his work has allowed him to contribute to various media sites such as CNN, CBS, BBC, Radio 4, The Washington Post, The Philadelphia Inquirer, NPR, Huffington Post, WHYY, Revolt TV, and more, okay? Every time you turn around, he's being quoted somewhere, okay? He lives in the Philadelphia area with his beautiful wife and his wonderful children. Without further ado, I'm going to bring to the stage, my guy. I happen to know him. If you don't know him personally, you ain't where I'm at. You ain't on my level. But I'm going to introduce my guy, Timothy Welbeck, Esquire. And he's going to take it away. And he is going to drop some knowledge on us today. So thank you so much for being here. And the stage is all.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for that gracious introduction. Thank you for having me. I also want to thank all of you who all are joining us today. I think it's fitting that you say welcome back because Sankofa means to go back and fetch it. And so those of you who return every year, it's just a great thing that we're doing to make sure that the culture is alive and well. As Dr. Taylor said, I'm Timothy Welbeck, Director of the Center for Anti-Racism at Temple University. And tonight I want to talk to you about one of the things I love most, and that's hip hop, and particularly its connection to Black people and the things that Black people, particularly those on the continent, have been doing for millennia. So much of what we take for granted within the culture are things that Africans have been doing since time immemorial. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm particularly just going to begin at the beginning in that when we think about hip hop, sometimes it's so difficult to even wrap our minds around what it is that we're talking about when we say hip hop. What is hip hop? How do you define it? What are its distinguishing characteristics? At times, I feel like if you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers, particularly when we begin to dissolve down from the broader cultural ideas of what it is to the actual music that the culture creates and informs. One of my favorite definitions of hip hop is what KRS said. He said, rap is what you do, hip hop is what you are. I love that definition in part because it's encapsulating this bigger idea that hip hop is a culture, is this dynamic, living, breathing outgrowth of the expression of Africans over time in a contemporary sense. And so with that, a lot of people, if you push them for a definition of what hip hop is and where it came from, many people will tell you that hip hop began in New York. If they're trying to be fancy, they may tell you in the early 1970s. If they really know what they're talking about, or if they think they know what they're talking about, they'll tell you August 11th, 1973. If they're really trying to flex, they may even tell you 1520 Sedgwick Avenue. Those who do that are doing that in part because, in a grander sense, that is considered the birthday of hip hop. We, in a lot of ways, commemorate the emergence of what we commonly refer to as hip hop beginning on August 11, 1973, with a back to school jam that was put together by Cindy Campbell and her brother, Clive Campbell, whom the world came to know as Kool Herc. According to legend, Cindy wanted some new clothes for the school year, and her Jamaican mother said, "You can wear what I bought you." And Cindy had other ideas. And so she was an enterprising young woman. And as with many things, much of the good in the world has come from enterprising women. And so she conceived of this idea of having a back to school jam and charging admission. And she believed that if she turned a profit, she could get what she was hoping for, and that she could buy some of the clothes that she wanted in the for the coming school year. But with that, they say hip hop was born that night in part because her brother was a DJ who had learned in part from observing his father. And her brother, Cool Herc, introduced a technique that night where he was extending the break beats or the solos of the rhythm section of various records and doing that time and time again throughout the night, going from one to the other. And he had a friend, T. LaRock, I mean Scott LaRock, I'm sorry, who was then improvising some chants and calling responses. And they say hip hop was born because you've got this instrumental sound bed and you've got what was the beginning of rapping happening on top of that. But in a lot of ways, hip hop didn't fall out the sky on August 11th, 1973. Hip hop is a part of a broader continuum of African derived expressions. Hip hop is a continuum of the ways that Black people come together, make music, create community, and communicate their lived reality, the highs, the lows, the joys, all in between. And so, in the same way that you have ancestors, hip hop has people, hip hop has ancestors. And when we're looking at that in a contemporary sense, then hip hop, like all Black expression, is political. So many people try to divorce it from its political realities because we now live in an era where hip hop has been commodified and its presence is ubiquitous. Hip hop is in places that don't have electricity and running water. They're places that the culture has touched in that way. But with that said, though, hip hop's emergence comes from this larger practice, this larger tradition of Africans exercising their agency, exercising self determination, communicating their experiences, passing along their traditions over time. Hip hop is a part of that. So, in many ways, this begins in the Western world when many of our people were brought to the Western world via the transatlantic slave trade. Dr. Malefi Asante calls it the European slave trade. He says that's a more apt title for it because he says the transatlantic region was not exporting people, but actually Europeans were. And I think that's a fitting way to even look at it. But as we're looking at the slave trade as these Africans who were made to be slaves or were told that they were enslaved, as they were brought across the ocean, their European captors anticipated or expected them to assimilate into some semblance of European culture. They wanted them to talk like Europeans, walk like Europeans, make music like Europeans. But at that point, these Africans had a decision to make. Would they acquiesce and assimilate, or would they do things that reminded them of who they were before they were made to be property? And that's what they did. They chose the latter. They chose that option to do the things that reminded them of who they were before they were made to be property. And so they took various forms of traditional West African music making. We call some of these things like tonal language, improvisation, heightened rhythm, antiphony. These are things I'll go through in greater detail in a moment. But these are various components of West African music making that these enslaved West Africans began to notice. They said, we come from different places. We may pray to different gods, speak different languages. We might have different ethnicities. But when we make music, there's similarities. We communicate meaning with tone and pitch. How we say something is just as important at times, sometimes more important than what we actually say. We at times create without prior rehearsal. We call that improvising. We do call and response. The SAT word for that is antiphony. We do this thing called collective participation, whereby the African performer performs with the audience rather than for the audience. And these West Africans took these various forms of West African music making and took the psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs of Western Europe and created something entirely new. We call those things spirituals. And spirituals are the foremother of all Black music in the Western world, and really all music in the Western world outside of the music that was made by the indigenous people of this land. And so, with that, spirituals gives birth to things like ragtime, which gives birth to things like the blues, jazz, gospel, soul, R&B, reggae, disco. Eventually, we get to hip hop. That's the family tree in many ways, a condensed Cliff Notes version of the family tree of hip hop. And in that way, hip hop is not something, as I said moments ago, that fell out of the sky, but is a continual expression of Black people fighting to have a sense of autonomy, agency, to self define, to self identify, to self communicate, to sing the songs of freedom, to do that in a way that fit the times. And hip hop becomes the newest way that happens. These young people in the Bronx in the early 1970s completely turned music on its head. They took music players and turned them into music instruments. We take for granted now that if we see somebody standing behind two turntables, that they're playing an instrument now. Prior to the late 1960s, early 1970s, that was not something that people would have recognized as a music instrument, but people would have looked at that as a music player in the same way that you might play music on your phone, or if you're an older millennial like myself, you might have had a boombox or a CD player or a Walkman, things like that. Those are music players. They play recorded music via some type of physical medium. A turntable was one of those music players until people like Cool Herc and Grandmaster Flash and Grand Wizard Theodore, DJ Grand Wizard Theodore, and others began to reimagine the usage of this music player and began to find a way to play it. Prior to the onset of hip hop in the way that we recognized it, people questioned the idea of how you can go about making recorded music by talking over someone else's music. People thought that that was a foreign concept. Before, the notion was you had to be able to carry a note, you had to be able to sing, you had to be able to do that with some other form of instrumentation. But these young people turned all of that on its head and created something that was entirely new. And with that, I say that hip hop is Black culture, because the foundational elements of what make hip hop are the various aspects of Black culture that have been sustained over time. And in that way, this reminds me of one of my former professors once said that culture is like energy. It cannot be created or destroyed, it can only be transferred. And in that way, hip hop is taking on the transferal of traditions and customs and mores over time, and using that in a contemporary sense to create something new and to reinterpret these older forms of expressions and conventions and communication to make something new, exciting, and dynamic, and is now the most dynamic cultural form in the world. And so, with that, when I say that hip hop is Black culture, another way of looking at it is that hip hop is an African derived aesthetic, meaning that the things that make hip hop, yes, are Black culture, but it's Black culture in part because it's coming from the continent of Africa where our people hail from. On the screen, I have for you an infographic of the actual size of Africa, because oftentimes when we say Africa, many people think about it as some conglomerate mass of people interspersed between wildlife here and there, but they don't really fully comprehend how massive the country is. Not, I just said country. See, I was thinking like other people, like how they think about Africa as a country, just one large country. That's what I was trying to say. But we take for granted how large the continent of Africa actually is. This infographic shows you actually the size of the continent. The continental United States can fit over most of what we call Western Africa. The nation of India, the nation of China, Eastern Europe, Western Europe can all fit on the continent of Africa. So when we say Africa, we're talking about more than 50 countries. We're talking about hundreds of languages, religious traditions, ethnicities, cultures, and the like. But when I say African for the duration of tonight, I'm particularly talking about West Africa. And I'm talking about West Africa because so many of the people who were enslaved and brought to the Western world were captured from West Africa. And these people were made to be property. And prior to that, they were Ga, Yoruba, Ashanti, Igbo, Eva, Mandinka. They were people with proud traditions, customs, history, and the like, religious practices, nation states, all of that over time. And they began to create not only ways of living, but in the process of doing that, at times there was overlap. The most significant of which, as I mentioned before, is when we're talking about the creation of music. And particularly in looking at the creation of music, there are some foundational elements or essential elements, some features that you will see throughout. I mentioned some of these earlier. I mentioned things like collective participation, improvisation, tonal language, antiphony or call and response, heightened rhythm, repetition. These are various ways in which West Africans in particular have, and all these are features that exist within all of them. There is a sociologist, Ortiz Walton. He wrote a article called "Music, Black, White, and Blue: A Sociological Survey of the Use and Misuse of Afro-American Music," and in it he was talking about how what is essential remained, and what he was talking about is these aren't necessarily the most foundational elements of the culture of these people groups, but these are the things that could survive being stripped of your name, your language, and your religion. These are things that can survive differences in nation and language and religion. These are things that can survive being stripped of the physical artifacts and manifestations of culture. These are some cultural elements that can survive when you're taken from your homeland and put in a new place. So when you cannot speak to the person that you are now being told is the same as you, when you cannot necessarily communicate and commune in ways that you may have before, you can still do some of these things, particularly around the making of music. So when I said things like collective participation, it's exactly what it sounds like. Think about anytime you see Africans come together. It doesn't matter where you see them. They could be at a festival like Odun Day. They could be at a church on a Sunday morning. They could be at a hip hop concert on a Saturday night. They could be at a jazz concert. When Africans get together, the performer understands that a foundational element is that I have to incorporate the audience in what I do. I don't perform for the audience, I perform with the audience. There isn't this larger sense of I will do what I do, wait for you to listen to me politely, and then applaud at the end. But in many ways, a performer will feel as though they have failed if they have not incorporated the audience in some way. We actually get one of hip hop's key DJing elements from this particular practice. Grandmaster Flash Joseph Sadler is widely considered one of the people who helped to advance DJing into an art form. And one of the things that he recognized that when Kool Herc was trying to transition from break to break, sometimes he would do so in a sloppy way. I mentioned breaks before. Breaks were a solo of the rhythm section. So during this period of time, oftentimes what you would see is DJs like a Kool Herc would say that there are songs that people really like, but instead of just playing the songs that they like, there's a part where people are most enthusiastic about. So rather than just playing the song that they like, why don't I go from that part that people like in one song and do that from one song to the next song? And what he was observing was that people like these things that they were calling breaks. It was literally the melody taking a break so that whoever was playing the rhythm, maybe the drums, bass, some songs maybe also including a piano or something like that, they would get a solo. Think James Brown, Funky Drummer, when he says, "Let the drummer get some," and Clyde Stubblefield goes on this epic drum solo. That's a good example of that. So Grandmaster Flash sees that when Cool Herc is doing that and going from break to break, sometimes he's missing the start of one break and the end of another. So sometimes the transitions were sloppy. And Grandmaster Flash realized that if he studied where a particular break started and could mark that on a record, he did this with a crayon, and could learn how to master the crossfader and listen to the other turntable was playing in his headphones, he could then go from one break to another break very smoothly. And so he did this, he masters this technique. And then after hours of practice, and the first time he tries to debut it, he does so, and the audience just is looking at him. And he was crestfallen. He actually wanted to quit DJing because the audience did not respond in the way that he wanted to. And he realized that the failure was not on the audience, the failure was actually on him, and that he did not incorporate the audience. And he said that he needed to add some showmanship and to incorporate some other ways to involve the crowd. So what he started doing was trying to scratch as he would transition. Sometimes he'd put a microphone down on the table where his turntables were and invite someone to rap while he was transitioning between those. One person turns into three turn into five, and then you get Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And as that happens, not only do we get the emergence of one of hip hop's iconic groups, but a foundational element of DJing emerges from that too. And so much of it hinged on Grandmaster Flash intrinsically understanding that you have to involve the audience because it's a cultural expectation to involve the audience in some way. I mentioned another one of these things was tonal language, the idea that we communicate with tone and pitch. How we go about saying something at times is just as important as what we actually say. When I teach this class sometimes at Temple, when I teach this lecture sometimes at Temple, one of the things I tell my students is that my son now, he's just about a teenager. He'll be 13 in a few months. But when he was younger, he used to like to tell jokes. And one of his favorite jokes was, "Why was the broom late?" But he's saying this as a toddler. So he would say, "Why was the broom wait?" And I would say, and so of course you would respond, "I don't know. Why was the broom late?" And he would say, "Because it overswept." Because it overswept. It was a dad joke told by a 2-year-old, but follow. I didn't tell my son that while we live in the Philadelphia area, we are West African as part of both our race, ethnicity, and cultural heritage. And one of the ways that we communicate a joke is with rising and falling intonation, and that's how you deliver a punchline. I didn't tell him all of that. But what he realized in watching the way that the people around him speak, one of the ways that they communicate, particularly a joke, is in this way. And this is something that he was able to master even as he was beginning to learn how to speak, because of this idea that when we speak, we do so in such a way that we're communicating something underneath the actual words by how we deliver the words. Think about so many phrases too in the Black lexicon, like "I wish you would," "I wish somebody would." Like, we're not literally saying we wish somebody would do whatever it is we're signaling in that moment, but we're actually saying the contrary, that someone better not have the audacity to do this thing that I'm mentioning in this moment. If they do, there'll be consequences and repercussions. And all of that is communicated in a sentence, particularly via the tone. Or think about this in a broader sense. So often, again, how we communicate is again with this underlying understanding of how words and tones converge to communicate meaning. So another example, I mentioned my son earlier. My son is a junior, so we have the same name, Timothy Welbeck. When at times people say, "Is it confusing when someone in your house is trying to get your attention, particularly your wife?" And I would say, for the most part, no, because I'm a grown man and my son is a child. So even if my wife is saying my name, when she's calling my son and when she's calling me, she's going to say our names, the same word, differently. And that tone is indicative of the fact of, oh, she's not talking to me, she's talking to my son. Or conversely, my son will know she's not talking to me, she's talking to my father. All of this again is a part of a broader tradition of how Africans communicate, and these things find their way into music as well. Think about so many of the rappers over time who have distinguished themselves, have risen above the fray. So often they're doing that because of how they're able to communicate these ideas with their tone. It's one of the things that separates so many of the greats from people whose names get forgotten in history. Think about the authority in Queen Latifah's voice. Think about the way that when she speaks or when she raps, when Dana Olin speaks or when she raps, she has a commanding presence. And so much of it is about, again, this tone. Think about Busta Rhymes at his peak. There are so many times where people may not have even understood what he was saying, but they were confounded and impressed by the way that he was bringing about. Or think about, in a more contemporary sense, Kendrick Lamar. So often he is using his voice as an additional instrument. And so many times he's switching cadences and the way that he delivers his actual words as a way to communicate these heightened meanings. At her peak, Nicki Minaj was doing the same thing. Like every 4 to 6 bars, she's changing her vocal inflections as a means in which to continue to captivate the listeners and at times to enhance our understanding of things, particularly what she's trying to communicate. Some of these other elements, improvisation, the creation of melody without prior rehearsal. Every form of Black music has improvisation in some way. Whether you look at solos in a church and people are going off on various riffs and adding ad libs to the text, or you think about jazz solos, how it becomes an expectation in a jazz ensemble for each instrument to break away and to play something new. Or how, like, same thing in the blues tradition that precedes jazz, that the same idea that communicating at times with this creation in the moment. And hip hop, we look at that particularly with rap music, with true freestyling, creating lyrics in the moment off the top of your head, not necessarily a pre written verse that no one else has heard before. Antiphony is an SAT word I told you for call and response. A speaker or performer will say something, will call out something to the audience that they expect for the audience to then respond to. So, one of the favorite examples I offer is particularly, again, when I'm teaching this in other settings, I might shout out, "God is good," and when I do that, some of my students are looking at me perplexed as to why I just said that. But then there's always a contingent of people who will say all the time. And then I'll say all the time. And then there's a contingent of people who will say, God is good. For people who are perplexed in that moment, I tell them that this is a call and response that is often happening within the community of church, right? Or some type of religious setting. And Ortiz Walton, the sociologist that I mentioned before, talks about that antiphony, call and response, is not just a cultural element that involves the audience, but it's also a teaching tool. And he talks about how it's a method in which the performer or the speaker will show the audience or other performers how to respond in a moment. And in this example that I just gave, that's actually a dual opportunity to teach. The speaker is teaching the audience that is perfectly permissible and actually expected that at times when the speaker speaks, that the audience will respond. And not only respond, but there are times even particular responses that are expected from the group that you're supposed to learn via your connection and participation within the group. But then also in that particular example, the speaker is also teaching something that they believe to be eternally true, that God is good all the time and that all the time God is good. And it's reinforcing this amongst the audience. And it's a way to reinforce ideas that they believe to be acceptable. And all of these various elements find their way into music making. Every single one of these forms are various elements of music making that's traditional to West Africans. John Salzman wrote the music chapter in the Encyclopedia of African American Music and Culture. And in that music chapter, one of the things that he mentions when he's talking about music making in enslaved communities at the time in which spirituals were beginning to emerge was how that there are things like the Pinkster holiday, which is a traditional Dutch holiday. When these Africans got a hold of it and began to incorporate some of these various elements and other traditional elements of West African music making and celebration, it became something entirely foreign to their captors. Or similarly, he gives examples. He even uses some firsthand accounts of some of these European captors who say that the words of these songs are the same, but at times it's vastly different. If I had a little bit more time for you, I'd give you an example of that. An example that I show for some of my students periodically is Aretha Franklin's rendition of Amazing Grace, circa 1974, thereabout. So Judy Collins sings a similar, not similar, she sings a rendition of it around a similar time, is what I'm trying to say. And though the two women are singing the same words, it sounds like they're singing an entirely different song, in part because Judy Collins is not incorporating any of these things that we're talking about. Judy Collins sings first verse, chorus, second verse, chorus, third verse, chorus, in a span of about 4 minutes, about 4 minutes and 10 seconds. At 4 minutes and 10 seconds, Aretha Franklin is still in the middle of the first verse of the song. And in part because she's incorporating so many of these elements that we're talking about here. As soon as the organist begins to play, someone's in the background. If you've heard the live recording, you'll hear them say, "Can I get an amen?" That's collective participation. Someone's already in the audience participating before Aretha has sung a note. And then from there, Aretha Franklin hums and bends these notes and rearranges them and holds them, twists them all up in her soul and releases them out to the congregation. That's tonal language. She's communicating with tone and pitch, sometimes without even saying words. If you've heard the recorded version, she'll also at times will improvise different ad libs and throughout. But again, this isn't something that's just restricted to one mode of music. It's something that is indicative of the way that Africans make music. And like I said, so often we see these things emerge in hip hop. I have a little bit of time. I'm going to show you some very brief examples. And I'm going to say brief because we're not going to get no YouTube copyright strike. So we're going to play about maybe 10 to 20 seconds of each of these songs, just so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about, particularly through the vantage point of hip hop. So I mentioned Kendrick Lamar earlier. Oh, hold on. So I mentioned Kendrick Lamar earlier. This is all right. Let me see if I can I'm able to play this. If not, it's all right. It's all right. We're going. We can continue without it. But here in All Right, if you've heard the recorded song, right? One of the things that Kendrick does throughout the entirety of the song is that he will use, again, his voice as an instrument. And there are some of Kendrick's contemporaries who have talked about that at times that while Kendrick will have double, triple, and sometimes quadruple entendres, sometimes the message of what he's saying is in how he's saying it. Sometimes the layers are in the way that he's presenting it, or even at times some of the actual communication of the weight of what he's saying is in how he says it. So like most infamously, I think the line in Not Like Us when he says, I'm trying to strike a chord and it's probably A minor. When he holds out A minor, I imagine the first time you heard that song, you're like, why is he saying this like that? And then when he continues to hold out A minor, you realize that he's not just holding a note, but there's layers of meaning of what he's just saying. So he does that throughout a lot of his music. Queen Latifah, I mentioned before, like she's got so much command of her audience when she raps, whether it's a recorded version, whether it's live performance, she's dynamic. She holds your attention in ways that few artists can. And so much of that is the tone of what she's saying. UNITY is a perfect example of that. The tone, it resonates throughout because here she's calling the community into account. She's saying that we have to come together and have a conversation. We need to have a family conversation. We have to come together because I am because we are. We are because I am. We are a community. And she does that in such a way that she grabs you literally from the very beginning. That saxophone solo begins, and you're captivated by it. But then she even does a call and response too. Like again, I imagine many of you have heard this recorded song before. When she does UNITY, when she sings that, that's a unity. She'll say UNITY, and then she comes back with a response. That's a call and response. Now she's performing it herself, but again, it's something that's emblematic of how so many of these features are finding their way into the music. This right here is Supernatural. He's a little bit more obscure than the other two artists that I just mentioned, but he is a rapper formerly based in Brooklyn. He's contemporary. Okay, he's a contemporary of Talib Kweli and Yassine Bey. He's a little bit older than them. He got a record deal a little bit before them. He was previously the Guinness World Record holder for the longest continual freestyle. Supernatural is such a gifted freestyler that it's difficult for him to write because he can literally freestyle for hours at a time, creating new lyrics, intricate, like with metaphors and entendres, switching flows and cadences. He can do all of this off the top of his head. In this particular video, he's at a magic convention in 2008, and he's doing a popular technique that he does in his freestyles. So he tells the audience to hold up an object, and I am going to incorporate the object that you held up in my freestyle. And so he tells the DJ to play. He does an introductory, maybe 4-bar rap. And then people start holding up items, everything from a wristband to a pack of gum, a helmet. This brother was rapping so good, a police officer came up to him and gave him his baton. I'm still astounded by that every time I watch this video. I'm like, this brother got a police officer to hand him his baton. That's a whole nother conversation. A woman holds up her hair, things like that. And he's able to successfully incorporate each of these items into his freestyle. And when he does, again, is a means in which to demonstrate that there is a ability to create in the moment, but then there's also an expectation to involve the audience. And so Supernatural is just one of those ones who's able to do that in that way. And so going to conclude this in part by giving somewhat of a quick story that sometimes I also use as a reference. So in many ways, I just talked about the what, I just talked about the how and the why, that these various forms of traditional West African music making find their way into the creation of Black music. In the most contemporary sense, we see that in hip hop. And one of the ways that creates a what is that rap lyrics then simultaneously become lyric poetry and performance art. So many rappers are creating their lyrics and using poetic device, assonance, consonants, rhyme, meter, metaphor, alliteration. All of these are poetic elements that can enhance both the written and the spoken word. But just about every rapper is writing or performing their lyrics with the expectation that they will be heard, felt, and understood. And there's a host of scholars across academia who have worked to preserve this heritage. People like Trisha Rose and Imani Perry, a host of other people have been for decades preserving this, both like these types of concepts, or even at its essence, what happens when we put these words out. People like John Morgan, and talking about the actual content of what we're saying when we use this poetry, things like that. And so there are some literary scholars, people like Adam Bradley and Andrew Du Bois, who wanted to afford hip hop the same level, particularly rap lyrics, the same level of deference that we give to other forms of Western poetry. The idea that the level of poetry that you might hear in someone like an Edgar Allan Poe is what you could hear in a Rhapsody. And so with that, they wrote this book called The Anthology of Rap, where they transcribed 300 rap songs, and they showed the evolution of emceeing from something that was elementary and simplistic in the beginning, very, very basic rhyming, to intricate and dense poetry that we now see in the likes of like the late MF Doom, for example. And so you see the arc of emceeing over the span of about 3.5 decades at the point of which they had written the book. And so I say that to say that I began this conversation talking about hip hop was created in part, or emerged in part, as the fight against cultural subjugation. One of the things that's important about that is that we document and chronicle our culture, and not only do that, but do so in a way that preserves the ideas of what happened, and that we do that ourselves. And one of the examples that I give is that, so when that book was released, Yale University Press put it out like circa 2010. And Sam Anderson is a book critic for The New Yorker. He wrote a review for that was subsequently published. At the time in which Sam Anderson wrote his review, he was admittedly hip hop illiterate, is how he actually classified himself. He had never actively listened to any rap music that he knew of, could not really explain what hip hop culture was in any type of meaningful way, had no understanding of what the difference was between the Notorious B.I.G. and Big Daddy Kane. Couldn't tell you the difference between Little Kim and Little Wayne. Just like he hadn't heard. And again, think about that for a moment. Like, he's reading the Anthology of Rap, which is a transcription of 300 rap songs, and he's never heard any of these people's voices, never heard any of the music behind it. And then he writes a review on it. So often every year, we get miffed by sometimes our exclusion at some of these broader cultural or societal celebrations, things like the Grammys and the Oscars and things like that. And I would encourage us at times to not chase the validation of external people groups, because oftentimes there's a missing affirmation of the humanity of us and the creation of the culture that we have developed over time. And this is a perfect example of that. Much can be said about the editorial decision of someone like Sam Anderson writing a review of the Anthology of Rap and being functionally hip hop illiterate. You wouldn't ask someone to write a review of Baroque music who had never heard of Vivaldi play, who had never heard of Mozart or Beethoven composition, but his editor let him do that. And so anyway, he came away with some pretty controversial opinions. Some of his opinions were okay, but he reads the Anthology of Rap and develops a healthy appreciation for rap music and the poetry behind it. And so he says some things that are good. So like when he says some of the greatest rappers of all time, he mentions people like Jean Grey, the late Chino XL, Jay-Z, Lupe Fiasco. So like he got some of those names right. But then he also said Big Daddy Kane is the greatest rapper of all time. And I would imagine that there would be some sharp disagreement about that if I were to poll some of you all about that. But then he also has some really controversial opinions about other celebrated acts. He thought Lil Wayne at the peak of his abilities was sophomoric and immature and couldn't really follow along. He thought Nas was boring. He said Nasir Ben Oladara Jones was boring. And then he said he didn't really get Big and why Big was considered to be one of the greatest. There are other people. He thought Wu-Tang Clan was creative and imaginative, but like it didn't translate into their art. Anyway, Sam Anderson has a colleague, Franny Kelly, who's a music editor at NPR. And Franny Kelly read his review and said, Sam, your review is okay, but I think that you would have a different opinion if you actually listen to the music. So she sent him 7 songs, asked him to listen to it, and then they had a conversation that they recorded. NPR made a story about it. And one of the first things that he says was that he realized that he had made a colossal error in making judgments about music before having heard it. Because he said the first song that he heard, which was ironically enough, Dead President's Hip Hop, he said that he made a decision that he liked the song before M1 and Stickman rapped a single word. And from there, he not only develops a healthy appreciation for that song, but overall the rapped word as an art form. And I say all that to say Sam Anderson did an informal experiment, and that he learned what many of us intrinsically know, that these songs, particularly in their compositions, at times can be dexterously written, but every single one of these artists wants you to hear and experience their music, in part because of all these cultural elements that we've talked about before feed into your understanding and your experience with the lyrics themselves. And so just even to conclude this example and to conclude even what I'm getting at as a whole, one of the things he talked about was, so like if you're familiar with hip hop, there's a line where Stickman says, would you rather have a Lexus or justice, or dream or some substance, a beam or a necklace or freedom? And so he says when you read that, it feels like a list. But when you hear Stickman rap it, particularly with the urgency in his voice, I'm sorry. When you hear the urgency in his voice, you realize that he's not reciting a list, but he's saying that in our society, these things are diametrically opposed to each other. The materialistic aim to acquire wealth and these material possessions are contradictory to the things and the values that will lead our people towards freedom. And so he began to get a rudimentary understanding of that by actually listening to the music. But with that, as all of us listen to the music, it is my hope that while we're listening to the music, that we're not just listening to the music, but that we're appreciating that what is happening in this music is a contemporary iteration of what has happened over time with Africans. And we found new ways to bring forth old, ancient forms of expression. And so much of that has sustained us over time, particularly as we have fought to affirm our humanity and dignity and the like. And so, with that, I want to pause and see if anybody has questions or comments or anything like that. I am grateful for the opportunity. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you all who have registered and joined, and for those who may watch it later. And with that, I will see if there are any comments. Dr. Taylor, you are muted.
It'd be nice if I could do this, right? No, I'm like so into this. Like it's been really amazing. And I'm sitting here just like learning stuff. I'm sitting here like interacting with the chat folks, like I'm just watching. So, hip hop is my thing. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments. Definitely I'm getting the sense that people have been enjoying this. And I know, when they have the replay for sure. Thank you. I am so honored that you came. It's funny that you were talking about antiphony, because I write about that in my book when I talk about how we communicate online. I think he got frozen. Let me see if he got frozen. I think he got a little frozen. It's okay. We'll take him out. But just that he wrote about, that I wrote about antiphony and this idea of this call and response as we use social media, right? And how we communicate there. And I really appreciated that he was able to make that connection. It is such a cultural thing. I do think that we lost Brother Welbeck. Might have frozen, but that's okay because what he did was absolutely amazing. Appreciate you for coming. You say you didn't register, but it's a great gift to stumble. That's exactly what we want for Sankofa Summer School. Like, we want people to find us and to get this knowledge and to be able to, actively engage. Please definitely check out our YouTube channel. Subscribe. We've got several more classes. We've posted several already. We've had about 4 so far. So if you are new to Sankofa Summer School, you've never participated in anything that we've done before, definitely go to our website, sankofasummerschool.com. You can get more information about what it is that we do. We are right now a virtual Afrocentric academy. We bring experts, professors, all these people who can come and talk about different topics as they relate to people of the African diaspora. We center the experiences of African people around the world, whether you are in Nigeria, the United States, Jamaica, the UK, or Fiji. We are centering your experiences as African people around the world. So definitely come and check us out. If you want to make a donation to support the work that we're doing, we want to make sure that we keep the whole thing going and that we compensate our instructors. You can go to sankofasummerschool.com/donate. And we appreciate all donations of all types. If you want to join us for more classes for this week, we definitely have more. I think we have a class every night this week. But definitely go to our website and see what's coming up. If you happen to catch this after Sankofa Summer School session for 2024 is done, that is okay. We will be back next year with more classes. And in the meantime, we encourage you to check for the ones that we've had now. We really appreciate everybody coming through. And thank you. Looking forward to seeing you join more of your Sankofa Summer School classes.